My father left me everything. So when my stepmother brought in an advisor and told me the will didn't matter, I learned how quickly grief turns into entitlement. My name is Ethan. I was born in Ohio in the early 80s, the only child of a man who built his life slowly and carefully, the way you lay bricks when you expect to live behind the wall you're making. I grew up in a quiet suburb, went to a public high school, paid my way through college with loans and a part-time job, and spent most of my adult life working in commercial logistics. I married once. I never had children. By the time this story began, I was 42 years old, recently bereaved, and still naive enough to believe that legal documents spoke louder than family pressure. The first time my stepmother asked me to split my father's estate, it wasn't framed as a demand. It came wrapped in concern, delivered with a careful tone, as if she were suggesting something practical, even kind. We were sitting in her kitchen, the one she'd renovated 2 years before my father died. Pale countertops, new cabinets, everything clean in a way that felt rehearsed. My father's coffee mug was still in the cupboard, turned upside down like it had been waiting for him to come back. She folded her hands on the table and sighed. "Ethan," she said, "I think your dad would have wanted fairness." That word stayed with me. Fairness. I had already read the will twice by then. Once alone in the lawyer's office, and again at home, sitting on my couch in the quiet that comes after a funeral when everyone else has gone back to their lives. The will wasn't complicated. It was direct, specific, almost stubbornly so. My father had left everything to me. Not most of it. Not the majority. Everything. The house. His savings. His investments. Even the old watch he wore every day and never let anyone touch. There was no mention of my stepmother's children. No clauses. No footnotes. No room for interpretation. I told myself that meant something. My stepmother's name was Linda. She had been married to my father for 13 years. She had 2 adult children from her previous marriage. They were polite to me at holidays. Distant, but polite. We were never close. We didn't need to be. Linda had always been cordial, but she'd never acted like a second mother. She didn't try. I didn't ask her to. My father used to say that was healthy. Clean lines. Now, sitting across from her, I realized those lines were being redrawn. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me the way people do when they're about to say something they've practiced. "I've spoken to an advisor," she said, "just to understand what's reasonable, what's ethical." That was when I felt it shift. Not sharply, just enough to notice. "An advisor?" I asked. She nodded. "A financial planner. Estate mediation, really. He's helped other families navigate situations like this. Situations like this." I didn't say anything right away. I watched her hands instead. Her nails were freshly done. A soft pink. The same color she'd worn at the funeral. She continued. "He thinks it would be appropriate to divide things. Not evenly, necessarily, but fairly. My kids lost your father too, in their own way." I wanted to say they hadn't lost their father. They'd lost a stepfather they tolerated. But I didn't say it. Grief makes people defensive. I understood that. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "But Dad was very clear." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Wills aren't always the final word, Ethan. Sometimes they don't reflect what a person really meant. That was the first time I felt something close to anger. My father had been many things, but unclear wasn't one of them. I left shortly after that. Told her I needed time. She agreed, quickly, as if she'd expected resistance. As if she'd already prepared for it. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation over and over. Not the words themselves, but the tone. The assumption. The way she spoke as though the outcome was a discussion, not a decision already made. My father and I had been close, but not sentimental. We talked about work, about money, about planning. When my mother died, he told me plainly that ambiguity caused damage. That clear instructions were a gift to the people left behind. He had rewritten his will 2 years after marrying Linda. That mattered. I called the attorney the next morning. He confirmed what I already knew. The will was airtight. No contest clause. No ambiguity. Linda was provided for during the marriage. The rest passed to me. "She doesn't have a legal claim," he said. "Not unless you offer one." That sentence followed me for days. Unless you offer one. The next call came a week later. This time, Linda wasn't alone. She asked me to meet her and the advisor at his office. I almost said no. Almost. Curiosity has a way of dressing itself up as obligation. I told myself I owed it to my father to hear everything out. That refusing would look defensive. That listening didn't mean agreeing. The advisor's office was downtown, in a glass building that smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. He stood when I entered, smiling broadly, already holding out his hand. "Ethan," he said. "I'm Mark. Thank you for coming." He had the kind of voice that never rushed. Calm, reassuring. The voice of someone used to other people's money. We sat around a small conference table. Linda to my left, Mark across from me. He opened a folder and began talking about legacies, about blended families, about fairness versus legality. He used phrases like moral obligation and emotional equity. Linda watched me the whole time. Finally, he leaned back. "Your father's will is clear," he said. "No one is disputing that. But sometimes what's legal isn't what's right for the family." "There is no family," I said before I could stop myself. The room went quiet. Linda's expression tightened. Mark adjusted his glasses. "I understand this is emotional," he said. "But consider the long-term impact. Relationships. Closure." I thought of my father, sitting at his kitchen table years earlier, explaining compound interest to me like it was a life philosophy. "I'm not interested in closure," I said. "I'm interested in honoring what my father chose." Linda inhaled sharply. "Ethan, my children grew up with him. He supported them. He paid for part of their college. He loved them." "He loved you," I said. "That doesn't mean he intended to support adults he didn't raise indefinitely." Mark interjected smoothly. "No one is asking for everything. Just a share. A gesture." That was the word again. Gesture. "How much?" I asked. They exchanged a look. Then Mark spoke. "Half." I actually laughed. It surprised me how natural it felt. "No," I said. "Absolutely not." Linda's voice sharpened. "You're being selfish." That was when the meeting ended. I walked out into the cold afternoon air feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. The clarity helped. So did the realization that this wasn't grief talking anymore. This was entitlement. Over the next few weeks, the messages came steadily. Emails, voicemails, carefully worded texts that alternated between disappointment and accusation. Linda reminded me of holidays, of favors, of how my father would be ashamed. Mark sent me articles about estate ethics. I stopped responding. At night, alone in my apartment, I reread the will one more time. Not because I doubted it, but because I needed to remember my father's voice. His certainty. The way he signed his name without hesitation. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about whether I would let someone rewrite my father's final decision because it made them uncomfortable. The answer, I realized, had already been given. After I stopped responding, the silence didn't bring relief the way I expected. It brought pressure. Quiet has a way of amplifying intent, and Linda didn't intend to let this go. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. Handwritten. My name centered carefully on the envelope, like it was meant to look personal instead of strategic. I didn't open it right away. I let it sit on the counter while I made coffee, while I stared out the window at nothing in particular. When I finally did open it, I wasn't surprised by what I found. She wrote about grief, about confusion, about how hard it was for her children to accept that their lives had changed so suddenly. She reminded me again that my father had been generous, that he'd always believed in helping people who needed it. She said she hoped I'd reconsider my position for the sake of peace. Peace. That word again. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. A week later, another message came. This time it was Mark. An email, professionally worded, with bullet points. He laid out options. Voluntary redistribution, trust structures, tax-efficient transfers. He framed everything as cooperation, mutual benefit, family harmony. Nowhere did he mention my father's actual words. I forwarded the email to my attorney and asked one question. "Is there any reason I should engage?" He called me back instead of replying. "They're testing you," he said. "They want to see if persistence will soften you. It often does." "It won't," I said. "I know," he replied. "But they don't." The third attempt was different. Linda showed up at my door. I hadn't given her my address. I still don't know how she got it. I opened the door without thinking, and there she was, standing too close, eyes already glassy like she'd been rehearsing tears in the car. "I just want to talk," she said. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We stood in the hallway of my building, the hum of the elevator filling the gaps between us. She looked smaller than I remembered, older. Grief had settled into her face in a way that felt permanent. "You're shutting me out," she said. "I'm setting boundaries," I replied. She shook her head. "Your father would be heartbroken." That one landed harder than the others. Not because it was true, but because she knew exactly why it would hurt. Don't speak for him, I said quietly. Her voice rose. My kids are struggling, Ethan. They feel erased. Like they didn't matter. They mattered to you, I said. That doesn't entitle them to his estate. She stared at me like she'd never seen me before. Maybe she hadn't. You're choosing money over family, she said. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Something colder. No, I said. I'm choosing to respect my father's decision. She left after that. No apology. No goodbye. Just the echo of her heels down the hallway. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment she invoked my father's name like a weapon. It made me think of the last conversation I'd had with him, months before he died. We'd been sitting on his back porch, the two of us watching the sun go down like we'd done 100 times before. He'd been thinner then, quieter. I updated the will, he'd said casually. I nodded. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The way he said it told me everything. You don't owe anyone explanations for the choices you make, he added after a moment. Especially when they're uncomfortable. I held on to that memory like a shield. 2 weeks later, the tone changed. Mark sent another email, this one less friendly. He mentioned legal scrutiny, potential challenges, the emotional toll of prolonged conflict. It was subtle, polite, but the message was clear. They were escalating. I met with my attorney again. He assured me nothing had changed. No legal grounds. No leverage. But, he said carefully, they can make things unpleasant. How unpleasant? I asked. Socially, he replied. Emotionally. Publicly. He was right. The phone calls started next. Not to me. To extended family. Old friends. Anyone who would listen. I heard about it through a cousin I barely spoke to anymore. She called one evening, voice hesitant. Linda says you're refusing to help, she said. That you're cutting everyone off. I closed my eyes. She's telling people I'm greedy. I said. My cousin didn't deny it. That was when I understood the real strategy. If they couldn't move me legally, they'd move the narrative. Turn me into the villain. The cold sun. The selfish air. It hurt more than I expected. I'd never cared much about being liked, but I cared about being understood. And suddenly, the story being told about me didn't resemble the truth at all. I stopped attending family gatherings. Not because I was ashamed, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining the same thing to people who had already decided how they felt. One afternoon, I found myself driving past my father's house without meaning to. The place was empty now. Linda had moved out. The windows were dark. The yard overgrown. I pulled over and sat there for a long time. This was the thing no one talked about. Not the money. Not the conflict. But the loss of a physical place where memories lived. Where decisions had been made quietly, deliberately. I remembered my father at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out, glasses low on his nose. The seriousness with which he treated preparation. How he'd once said that love without clarity was a burden you leave behind. Linda and Mark were asking me to pick up that burden for their comfort. I wasn't going to. The final attempt came in the form of a mediation request. Formal, structured, neutral third party. I almost declined outright. But something told me this was the last card they had. If only to close the door properly, I agreed. The mediator was an older woman with calm eyes and no patience for theatrics. She let Linda speak first. Linda cried. Spoke about blended families. About intentions. About how unfair it felt to be left with nothing. I waited. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. No emotion. No justification. My father made a decision, I said. It was informed. It was intentional. I'm honoring it. The mediator nodded. Do you acknowledge the emotional impact on the other parties? Yes, I said. But emotions don't rewrite legal or moral responsibility. Mark tried once more. Framed it as compromise. As generosity. I shook my head. I'm not withholding something that belongs to them, I said. I'm retaining something that was given to me. The mediator closed her folder. I see no path forward here, she said. That was it. No dramatic ending. No reconciliation. Just an understanding that this line would not move. When I walked out of that office, I felt something close to peace for the first time in months. Not because the conflict was over, but because my role in it was. I had stopped reacting. Linda didn't contact me again after that. Neither did Mark. The rumors faded slowly. Some people never came back. Others did, quietly, after realizing the story they'd been told didn't quite add up. I learned something during that time. Something my father probably already knew. Inheritance isn't just about assets. It's about authority. about who gets to decide when someone's voice is gone. And I wasn't about to let his be rewritten. Once the noise died down, I expected things to return to normal. That was naive. What came instead was a quieter reckoning. Without Linda's messages or Mark's carefully worded emails, there was suddenly nothing to react to. No one to argue with. No position to defend. The conflict had given my days a strange structure, and when it disappeared, it left a hollow space behind. I still woke up early. Still went to work. Still answered emails and attended meetings like nothing had changed. But in the evenings, when I came home to an apartment that felt too orderly, I realized how much of my energy had been spent bracing myself. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. It circles. It waits for silence. I started sorting through my father's belongings then. Not the big things. The small ones. Boxes he'd labeled years ago and never reopened. Old manuals. Receipts. Notes written in his careful handwriting. In one box, I found a folder marked Ethan, Personal. Inside were copies of documents I'd forgotten existed. My birth certificate. My college transcripts. Even a resume I'd written in my 20s, the ink faded but still legible. At the bottom was a single sheet of paper. Not legal. Not formal. Just a note. I made my choices with a clear head. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I sat on the floor and read that line over and over until the room felt smaller. That note didn't change anything legally. It didn't stop the rumors or undo the tension that still lingered at the edges of extended family gatherings. But it anchored me in a way nothing else had. For the first time since he died, I cried without feeling defensive about it. The house sold faster than I expected. Linda had already removed what she wanted before leaving. I didn't question it. I didn't inventory the missing things. The absence felt intentional, like she was drawing her own line through the past. When the sale closed, I stood alone in the empty living room one last time. The walls were bare. The floors echoed. The place no longer smelled like coffee or old books. I locked the door and didn't look back. That should have been the end of it. Clean. Contained. It wasn't. A few months later, I got a call from one of Linda's children. The older one. We'd never spoken directly before. He sounded tired. Not angry. Just worn down. She's struggling, he said. Financially. I listened without interrupting. She thought things would work out differently, he continued. That you'd come around. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was careful now. Careful not to reopen doors I'd closed deliberately. I'm sorry she's struggling, I said finally. But that doesn't change my decision. There was a pause. Then a sigh. I figured you'd say that, he replied. I just wanted to hear it directly. After we hung up, I sat with the discomfort. It would have been easier if he'd been angry. Easier to dismiss. But he hadn't asked. He hadn't demanded. He'd just told me what was happening. For the first time, I wondered if holding my ground meant accepting that other people would suffer because of it. I thought about that for a long time. In the end, I came back to the same truth. My father hadn't left Linda unprovided for. He'd left her exactly what he intended to. Her expectations had simply exceeded reality. That wasn't my burden to correct. Work became my refuge. Predictable. Logical. Numbers that added up the same way every time. I took on extra projects. Stayed later than necessary. Avoided the quiet at home. Friends noticed. Asked questions I deflected. It's just a phase, I told them. But phases, I learned, still leave marks. The next holiday season arrived without ceremony. No invitations. No awkward conversations. I spent Thanksgiving alone with takeout and a movie I barely watched. It wasn't sad the way I'd imagined it would be. Just still. On Christmas morning, I opened a small box I'd kept aside since the estate was settled. Inside was my father's watch. Heavy. Scratched. Familiar. I put it on and felt the weight of it settle against my wrist. That was when the guilt finally arrived. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet question. Could you have done more? I sat with that question until it lost its edge. Doing more would have meant doing differently. It would have meant overriding a decision that wasn't mine to revise. It would have meant choosing temporary peace over long-term truth. I had learned what that kind of choice looked like. I'd seen it in the way Linda tried to rewrite the story, in the way Mark talked about ethics without ever mentioning consent. I wasn't going to participate in that. The last message I ever received from Linda came months later. A short email. No accusations. No requests. I hope you're well, it said. I hope one day you understand why I tried. I read it once and deleted it. Understanding doesn't always require agreement. By the time spring came, the estate was fully behind me. The money sat where it belonged. Untouched, mostly. I hadn't spent it impulsively. I hadn't used it to prove anything. What it bought me wasn't luxury. It was margin. Time. Space to breathe without negotiation. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling like I needed to justify myself at all. The story people told about me faded into irrelevance. The only one that mattered was the one I could live with when the house was quiet and the watch on my wrist ticked steadily forward. My father had trusted me to stand where he no longer could. I had done that. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance. Time didn't heal anything the way people like to say it does. What it did instead was create distance. Distance from the urgency, from the noise, from the versions of myself that had reacted instead of chosen. A year passed without any contact from Linda or her children. No updates. No appeals. Whatever struggles they were facing them without me as a reference point. That absence felt deliberate on both sides, and I learned to respect it. What I hadn't expected was how often my father would show up in ordinary moments. Not as memories, exactly. More like echoes. I'd be in the grocery store, reaching for the generic brand because it was practical, and I'd hear his voice in my head, dry and amused, saying, "Name brand is just a tax on impatience." Or I'd catch myself checking an expense twice, not out of fear, but habit. He'd trained me without ever announcing it. One afternoon, while reorganizing files at work, I realized something else. I was calmer, more decisive. The conflict had stripped away a layer of doubt I hadn't known was there. I no longer hesitated when people pushed. I didn't over-explain. I said no without apology. That change didn't come without cost. A mutual friend of Linda's reached out one evening, someone I'd always gotten along with. She invited me for coffee under the pretense of catching up. I agreed, knowing exactly what it would turn into. She didn't disappoint. "She feels abandoned," the friend said gently, stirring her drink without looking at me. Like she lost everything at once. I nodded. "She lost her husband," I said. "So did I. That's not what I meant." "I know," I replied. "That doesn't make it untrue." The friend hesitated. "Don't you ever wonder if holding the line so firmly made things worse?" I thought about it. Really thought. "No," I said. "I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't." That ended the conversation. Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights low, city noise humming outside. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel cruel. I felt resolved. There's a difference. The money remained mostly untouched. Not because I didn't need it, but because using it still felt symbolic. Like moving too quickly would cheapen what it represented. I let it sit, accruing interest, doing exactly what my father would have expected it to do. Work continued. Promotions came. Responsibilities increased. I was trusted more, relied on more. People noticed the steadiness. They didn't know where it came from, only that it was there. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if my father had anticipated this conflict. If he'd known exactly how it would play out. If the will had been as much a test as a provision. That thought unsettled me. I didn't like imagining him anticipating betrayal. But I couldn't deny that he'd been careful. Strategic. He'd known people would talk about fairness instead of intention. He'd trusted me to withstand that. The second year brought a different kind of challenge. Not pressure, but opportunity. I was offered a chance to relocate. A bigger role. More influence. It would require leaving the city entirely. Starting somewhere new. The old version of me would have hesitated. Weighed everyone else's expectations. Considered who might feel left behind. This time, I made the decision in a day. I packed my apartment slowly, deliberately. Kept only what mattered. Donated what didn't. When I reached the box containing my father's things, I didn't linger. I knew what to take. The watch. The note. A single photograph of the two of us standing on that porch years ago. Neither of us smiling, but both of us content. On my last night before the move, I sat on the floor amid half-packed boxes and let myself feel it all. Not regret. Not nostalgia. Gratitude. For the clarity. For the discomfort that forced growth. For the understanding that love doesn't always look like accommodation. Before I left, I drove past the old neighborhood one final time. Not the house. Just the streets. The corners where my sense of responsibility had formed quietly, over years, without applause. I didn't stop the car. As I merged onto the highway, I checked the time out of habit. The watch ticked steadily, indifferent to the past, faithful to the present. I realized then that this chapter hadn't been about inheritance at all. It had been about authorship, about who gets to decide how a life's work is carried forward, and who has the strength to honor that decision when it becomes inconvenient. My father had chosen me not just to receive what he built, but to protect the meaning behind it. I had done that, and for the first time since his death, I felt something close to pride. The new city didn't feel like a fresh start in the dramatic sense. There was no rush of reinvention, no sudden lightness. It felt neutral, which I came to understand was its own kind of relief. I rented a modest place close to work. Nothing sentimental, nothing temporary either. Just walls, light, and enough quiet to hear my own thoughts without interruption. I unpacked slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wasn't in a hurry anymore. On my first morning there, I made coffee and drank it standing by the window, watching strangers move through their routines. None of them knew me. None of them knew my father. The absence of context felt clean. Work absorbed most of my attention. The role was demanding in a way I welcomed. People relied on me without needing to understand where my steadiness came from. I didn't offer explanations. I delivered results. Occasionally, in meetings, someone would push too hard, try to reframe a decision after it had already been made. I noticed how easily I shut that down now. Calmly, without apology, without escalation. That used to scare me. The firmness. I'd worried it made me cold. Now I understood it as clarity. I didn't hear from Linda again. Not directly. Once, months later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd downsized, that she was working again, that her children were figuring things out. I didn't ask for details. There was a time when that would have made me feel cruel. Like indifference was a failure of compassion. But distance had taught me something important. Compassion doesn't require participation. You can wish someone well without stepping back into their story. One evening, after a long day, I sat on my couch and realized something else had changed. I wasn't replaying conversations anymore. Not defending myself in imagined arguments. Not rehearsing explanations for people who weren't listening. The story had settled. Not into something triumphant. Not even something resolved. Just finished. I took out the note my father had written and read it again, slowly. The paper was worn now. The edges soft. I made my choices with a clear head. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. For a long time, I'd thought that sentence was meant to reassure me. Now I saw it differently. It wasn't reassurance. It was permission. Permission to stop carrying other people's discomfort. Permission to trust that clarity doesn't need consensus. Permission to let consequences belong to the people who create them. I folded the note and put it back where it belonged. Later that year, I made a decision about the money. Not a dramatic one. Not a symbolic one either. I invested part of it, set aside part of it, and quietly used some of it to fund a scholarship at my old high school. No plaques, no announcements, just help where it would matter, without strings. That felt right. On the anniversary of my father's death, I didn't visit a grave or mark the day publicly. I went for a long walk instead. Let the city move around me. Let time pass. At some point, I stopped and checked the watch. Still ticking. Still steady. I realized then that this was how things continued. Not with closure, but with alignment. Not with forgiveness ceremonies or reconciliations, but with living in a way that didn't betray what mattered. I had done what my father trusted me to do. I had protected his voice when it was no longer convenient to hear. And in doing so, I had finally learned to protect my own. That was the end of the conflict. Not because everyone agreed, but because I no longer needed them to. Life moved forward the way it always does. Quietly, persistently. And for the first time in a long while, so did I.